Hello, YouTube. I have something a little bit different for you today because I am interviewing a philosopher, Carlos Mariscal. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's Spanish. It's Mariscal, but you're good. Don't worry about it. It's fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
I may not be able to get the subtleties of that quite right. So
You're fine. Nobody does. You're good.
yeah, and we will be talking about philosophy of astrobiology. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say by way of introduction, but that's pretty much all I have to say.
Yeah. No. I thank you for having me. I'm glad to be a part of this and to share some really cool ideas with the world and with your audience. So,
Great. Yeah.
do they know what astrobiology is? Probably not.
Well, I think that this is where we should begin.
Let's do it. Yeah.
So I've said we're going to be talking about philosophy of astrobiology. What exactly is that? For those who don't
Good.
know.
So I'll try not to define philosophy because you're aware. But astrobiology is probably going to have some of the same difficulties as any discipline in terms of how to define it. Except that this is one of those disciplines that was specifically constructed in order to address some, I guess, some financial issues and some scientific issues. It just happened to be that there was a combination of people in the mid-90s who were interested in questions that had been asked since the 1960s, and they were they wanted to reestablish what NASA was looking for with respect to the life sciences, what was going to be interesting for NASA. So it's kind of a motley crew of different areas of study, from origins of life to extreme organisms to life in the universe to detection. And so one of the things that I find fascinating about a science like astrobiology, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting questions that come up that relate to many aspects of philosophy, including ethics, right? Like, should we go and possibly contaminate nearby planets? Should we bring stuff back? Should we mine asteroids? But there's also more conceptual questions like, what are we even looking for if we're looking for life elsewhere? How could we know if we found it? What is life here on Earth? And questions of that sort. So I'm interested in all of the conceptual questions raised by astrobiology. And I think that there are so many because this is one of the areas of science that's really on the forefront, right? We know so little about life in the universe. Well, we know nothing else besides life on Earth. And so philosophy of astrobiology is this field that me and, I don't know, a couple of dozen other people are trying to develop as this robust area of inquiry where there's lots of topics that are going to be more and more well developed to explore to address any of these questions. I hope that makes sense. I realize that sometimes I talk to philosophical audiences, and sometimes I talk to scientific audiences, and sometimes I talk to lay audiences, and there's very little overlap.
I think that made sense to me. I mean, so I guess we're talking about the questions more generally concerning like the origin of life, the distribution of life in the universe,
Right.
The future of life, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. And well, I mean, you mentioned there are many philosophical issues that arise here. So one that I wanted to focus on, I guess, were these conceptual questions about just the general nature of life. And I mean, you've done some work on this. I guess the first question, if you're asking about life in the universe, is going to be, well, okay, what exactly are we looking for? What is life? So,
oh, cool.
yeah.
And I actually think those are two separate questions, by the way. What are we looking for, and what is life? But I'm not sure. So I don't know if you finished your question. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. I mean, I guess what I was leading on to there was
Sure.
the debate concerning life definitionism, and well, actually, I was leading into this position that you've held,
Right.
which would entail that, like you say, there are maybe two separate questions here rather than one. So, but I suppose first of all, just to start off with, there has been a long history of debate about what exactly life is, and
Right.
this is known as the life definitionism debate.
Sure.
But I guess that has. Well, it's sort of not. It hasn't really produced much in the way of a consensus. I mean, maybe it might be worth going into some of the problems that
Good.
this debate has encountered.
Sometimes I think that Plato set the standard too high for definitions, right? We, as philosophers, we tend to look for what we call theoretical definitions or philosophical definitions, which are sets of conditions that are each individually necessary and jointly sufficient to bring about some phenomenon. And, maybe you could do that with constructed systems like geometry, right? A circle is a set of points equidistant from one other point, or an infinite set of points equidistant from another point. But I don't think you can do that in in anything that's more real that occurs on this world. You can get closer, maybe bachelors or unmarried males, but there's questions raised there, like, are dogs bachelors or children bachelors, or is the Pope a bachelor? So when it comes to life, it's a question that's been asked at least since Aristotle, and that there's been a number of approaches, and people break down these approaches in a variety of ways. So some people think, life is going to have to do with how it reproduces, or maybe evolutionary processes. Some people think it has to do with metabolic issues, maybe some physics, some information sometimes comes into play. And even when you read Aristotle wasn't quite in agreement with himself. He has a variety of different positions where scholars debate which one he holds to be the most central. But you fast forward, you study the next couple of thousand years of research into this, and if anything, there's less and less consensus over time. In my dissertation, I went over a couple of hundred definitions, and I try to categorize them. Back when I thought that categorizing definitions was a useful project. And there's just very little consensus. And I think the reason there's very little consensus is that people come from different disciplines, and they have different explanatory strategies, and they're looking for different things. They want to save the phenomena, but that they think is interesting and special about life, but they're coming at it from entirely different perspectives. So a biologist who does a lot of micro or molecular biology will really think that the chemistry is super special. But somebody that does a lot of modeling will think, no, there's an abstract algorithmic feature of it that's the most interesting feature. And I think these debates are presuming that there's some one thing that it is to be life that is going to have membership conditions, and that everybody will, in some sense, agree on. When we discover some muck on Mars or Europa or somewhere, we're going to see it and think, oh, well, obviously this is life, and that reveals that the information theorists were correct. I don't think that's going to happen. Like, I think we're going to discover muck, and there's going to still be the open question about whether it counts as life. In the same way that viruses and prions exist on this planet, and there's still debate over whether they count as life. I mean, there's debates all over the place about when life starts, when it ends, right? Those are maybe more familiar to some of the viewers. And so I think what's going on, in fact, is we have this single example of what the phenomenon that we think is interesting, life here on Earth. And all life that we know of has the last universal common ancestor. We're all cousins. Plants and fungi and bacteria and archaea and us are all cousins. And so there's this ancestor and all of its descendants, and we all think that is an example of life. And what we're doing is picking out different features of it that we find interesting and relevant and salient, and looking for things that are relevantly similar to those features that we care about. So really what's going on is something that might be called, we've got this exemplary, this individual, right? Life on Earth starts at a time, will die out at a certain point. It's an individual, it's an entity, it's a distributed entity, but it's still an entity. And what we're looking for is something that's relevantly similar, but people are going to disagree as to what similarities matter and how similar it has to be. And I think that's all we're going to get. I don't think we're going to find the thing that makes life life. I think there's just different degrees of similarity that different people will think are relevant and salient and important.
Yeah. So you mentioned something there. You said that life was an individual,
Yes.
and we are kind of going to just be judging this individual against presumably other types of individuals we might find at some point in the future.
Sure.
On the basis of these similarities. So you've argued in... I'm really sorry, but I can't remember the title of the paper, which is...
Life and Life Only, maybe?
I think that might be the one. I really should have written that down.
No, you're good.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So you've argued that that we should think of life as an individual rather than a kind. And so this, when you describe life as an individual, this is quite important, I guess, metaphysically or philosophically. What exactly is this individual kind distinction about?
Yeah, good. And good. Thank you for picking that up, because that's one of those things that's inside baseball within philosophy of biology that sometimes I forget is not common in other areas. There's a metaphysical distinction between classes and individuals. Classes are things that you can come in and out of. Individuals, you cannot. They start and stop and they die out, right? So you and I are individuals. If somebody got lots and lots of plastic surgery to resemble you, they still would not be you, right? Because they don't have the right history. They don't have the right sort of features. On the other hand, if you sign up for a class in a university, let's say, you are a member of that class just by enrolling, and you can disenroll and re-enroll, and other people can enroll. You are a member of that class in that way. So there's this move that has actually been well accepted in the philosophy of biology with respect to species. and that is that species are individuals. So if we were to go to Mars and find a something that it was identical to a fruit fly in every way, but we knew for certain that it did not evolve from fruit flies, it would still not be a fruit fly. It would not get to be a fruit fly in the same way that I'm trying to think of one of the species. I think coral snakes evolved to resemble other. There's these species that evolve to resemble each other. They don't get to become members of that species, right? So that's the metaphysical distinction, and there's cool features about this, and that like individuals can be members of many classes, and we care about individuals' histories, whereas we don't care about the history of classes as much. A particular oxygen atom gets to be an oxygen atom just because it has 8 protons. It doesn't matter what star it was formed on. It gets to be a member of that class for that reason. So if species are individuals, which is well accepted, and it might be a controversial thought to people that aren't well versed in this area, but philosophers spent decades wrestling with it, and it's well accepted. This is just the next move up, that not only are species individuals, but so is all of life on Earth. It starts at a certain point, and it will die at a certain point. It has a history, and there are no membership conditions except for that particular history. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
I don't know if...
So,
yeah. Oh, sorry, were you not...
No. Just the point is that if it's an individual, then it belongs to many different classes, some of which are evolutionary, some of which are metabolic, some of which are other things that we find interesting. Yeah. But life is an individual.
So just going back to this point about species as individuals, I mean, I can imagine people being like, hang on a minute, wait a minute, what's the individual here? I mean, obviously a particular organism is an individual because it's a single thing, but if you've got horse, right, the species horse, right, these are a bunch of individuals, so what sense does it make to say that the species is an individual? I can see people being... I don't know if maybe you could expand on just why it is that we might think of species as individuals.
Great. So, well, first you can challenge us as being individuals in that sense, right? Like, yes, there's some clear boundaries that for our purposes delineate a Carlos from a Kate, right? Like, you can tell that I am not my desk because of these nice, clear boundaries. But over the course of my lifetime, I'll replace all of the cells in my body, and I'll replace all of the atoms in my body, and I'll replace all of everything in my body gets replaced. And furthermore, there's a lot of stuff that makes me that is not, quote, is not Carlos, right? Like 98% of the cell types in my body are prokaryotic. They're bacteria and archaea that live in and around me, without which I would not be able to digest. If you know anybody with like Crohn's disease or other digestive issues, you know this. Without them, I wouldn't be able to reproduce, right? Like some of the very basic features are murky. Now, when it comes to let's say I remove my arm, and then it gets reattached by a skilled surgeon. I'll have a really gnarly scar, but we'll still say that afterwards that's still Carlos. I'm Carlos. I wasn't Carlos without an arm, and then Carlos with an arm. I was a distributed Carlos. You might say it was Carlos's arm. You might say a number of things. Okay. when it comes to horse, the species, horses speciated at a certain point from some equus ancestor. I'm not. I remember the diagram in the book, but I don't remember what else. So they speciated. There was a moment in time, probably a couple of thousand generations, that from which the thing that we would recognize as the ancestor of horse became what we would now recognize as horses. And they'll probably die out at a certain point. Maybe when the world gets overrun by climate change, who knows? So they are temporal. They're temporally bounded. They're also spatially bounded, right? Like every individual horse has a particular relationship to its parent, directly to its mother, right? Horses were you get the mitochondria from your mother, and most of your body is made from you get the ovum from your mother makes most of the cells in your body. So you develop there's overlap between each individual organism. So there's a connectedness. It's a little weird and it's a little difficult to think about because you see horses being separate from each other. But some of my cells are really far apart from each other as well. And so the distance here is a difference of degree, probably not of kind. Mm-hmm. And the really cool part about that is if the species horse is an individual, well, each individual horse is also an individual, but there's also organs within horses, and those have their own individuality as well, right? Like they all have a history. They all they're identified by their history, not by similarity conditions. Yeah, I hope that makes sense, because the reason I keep emphasizing history is that's what makes individuality different from classes or kinds. Yeah. A kind is distinctive because of some similarity. Individual is distinctive because it originates and dies out at a certain point.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that makes sense. I get, so if you were to kill off all of the horses, then no matter what happens in the future, you're not going to get horses ever again.
That's right.
You know, because, yeah. So you get things maybe that might look a lot like horses, but I guess on this view, they just wouldn't be horses.
Yeah. Unless, I mean, there's some weird metaphysical questions about like de-extinction, right? If you were to take some horse DNA but you get the same things with like resurrection of a human, right? Like you die for 6 minutes and you come back, or maybe a Frankenstein's monster scenario. Like, okay.
I suppose ignoring situations like that, then
right.
You could. Whereas if you somehow eliminated all of the oxygen, and then at some point in the future, some atoms with 8 protons popped up. You'd have oxygen again. So is that?
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's it's kind of cool that it's kind of cool that that's a feature of oxygen, right? Like, I mean, it's kind of cool that these are distinct metaphysical kinds, because it means that they have different problems, different benefits, different issues, and it's just important to know what it is that you're talking about, whether it belongs to one or the other, or both in certain respects, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I'm an individual, but I can be a member of various classes, like middle class, presumably. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the individual kind distinction, and your claim then is that life itself is an individual, not a kind. So
That's, yes.
what's the...
So yeah, good.
Yeah.
I distinguish life with a capital L from life with a lowercase l. This
Right.
is work I've done with Ford Doolittle. So life with a capital L, individuals have proper names. I have a proper name. You spell my name with a capital C. So we'll call life on Earth life with a capital L. It's an individual. Now, a lot of scientists are still going to say, well, good, but when we go out to Mars or Alpha Centauri or Europa or whatever, we're not looking for life with a capital L. We're looking for something else. And we'll say, yes, what you're looking for is something that's really, really similar in ways that you care about, that scientists have decided matter, to life here on Earth, life with a capital L. Well, maybe we'll reserve life with a lowercase l for that. But note that there's no necessary and sufficient conditions for life with a lowercase l. There's just, we're just looking for things that are similar. And the similarity, there's an infinite number of ways that things are similar to each other. So the similarities that are going to matter are going to be made as a decision by scientists. Scientists will get together and decide what similarities they care about. When they find muck on other planets, do they care that it's got lots of carbon in it, or do they care that it seems to be processing the environment? Do they care that it resists perturbations? Those sorts of things. So the slogan is, it's discovering life. Life is a decision. It's not a discovery. There's nothing that we're going to discover out elsewhere in the universe that's going to just hit us over the head and make us realize, oh, obviously that is what life always was. I mean, the pushback here would be if somebody says, well, what if we discovered that, like, Star Trek, we live in the Star Trek world, right? Everything's just humans with like little putty on their nose. Well, in that case, all right, there's less motivation for accepting this metaphysical thesis that we have, but I don't think it stops it from being broadly true. It's just, it's less intuitive. Like,
yeah, so I guess,
yeah.
I mean, if we were to discover the little green men wandering around on some planet, then, I mean, the intuition that most people would have would be, okay, that's just life. But I suppose that wouldn't, what you're not going to get from that is an answer to this question of, okay, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as life?
Right.
Like, I suppose that problem is still going to be there. I mean,
Right.
You're still going to have the problem of viruses and prions and the muck that might be on Mars.
Right. Yeah, well, let's say we discover little green men and they're infected by their own COVID virus of some sort. Does that get to count as life? I mean, it's still a question. There's still, the question never went away. It just, you can damp it down because there's a lot of agreements by the scientific and lay community at a certain point. When you get lots of agreement, people think that the question goes away, but it never actually goes away. There's no like necessary and sufficient conditions. And the 20th century, we moved away from looking for necessary and sufficient conditions in favor of, so Wittgenstein was pushing for family resemblance concepts. Other people think of theory. Well, I could go into the concepts literature, but that seems to take us far away. But the idea is that we don't need necessary and sufficient conditions as much, and we don't actually use them as humans as much.
Yeah. So the the view then is going to be that there is this thing, this individual on Earth that is life, right? And then what we, in, I guess, more kind of pragmatic or colloquial contexts, the way we use the term life is just going to be based on judging things against this individual on the basis of various similarities.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think life is probably closer in terms of how abstract it is to maybe a notion like justice to a notion like water, right? A lot of people think water is H2O, despite the fact that if you just have H2O without the minerals, without any isotopes, you don't actually get lots of the features we recognize as water features. But people say water is H2O, and then people say justice is all of these things, and there's all of this disagreement. I think we're going to have lots and lots of disagreement about life, no matter what.
Yeah.
Right. So
with respect to life as an individual, then, I mean, it occurs to me that one concern about this might be, okay, if I take a species like horse, then there are a lot of mechanisms that ensure that all horses have some similarities, right? Like there are mechanisms that ensure cohesion. They in some sense they are evolving as a single group. And indeed, if some population of horses were to split off on an island somewhere, and completely different evolutionary pressures mean that they start going in some different direction, then you'd probably say, oh, the speciation has occurred, you've now got two different species. So it looks like in the case of species, there isn't just this, it's not just like ancestor descendant relations, there are also these mechanisms that ensure cohesion. And I mean, I can sort of imagine somebody saying, well, that's one of the reasons why it might make sense to think of a species as an individual rather than a kind. It doesn't look like you've got the same thing going on with life. I mean, is that a problem?
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I do think you actually have that with life, in the sense that all life shares a genetic, like life with a capital L, shares a genetic code. We share ways of translating that genetic code. We share lots of features that ensure a cohesion of a certain sort. But can I swear in this?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't need to swear.
You can, yeah, go ahead.
I should just say crummy. But there are like really, really exemplary, wonderful individuals, and there's kind of like shitty individuals. And the idea is, like a rock, like you can tell the difference between a rock and the sand around it, especially if it's a nice, good, clean rock. But like ooze in a puddle, it's like less differentiated. It blends. There's like less cohesive mechanisms keeping the ooze together than the rock. So that same thing happens with species, right? So humans, we share 99.5% genetic identity with each other. We're really, 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 really similar. On the other hand, E. coli, this bacterium, can share as little as like 30% genetic identity, right? So the cohesive mechanisms for different species vary wildly. And I mean, to that extent, a lot of people in the microbial biology community or microbiology community really start resisting species concepts in general. It gets really hard to distinguish what counts as one species versus another. So you end up having to use proxies of things that you don't think change very much over time. But life has cohesive mechanisms that make it so that, for example, pathogens that are really far apart can evolutionarily, like a bacteria, could get you sick. you're really, really far apart from them evolutionarily, billions of years, and yet it can make you sick. And that's because it shares a lot with you, and it can strip you of a lot of the nutrients that you produce. So yeah, I do think that there's some cohesive mechanisms. Now, it's true that there are some species, some individuals that are much more cohesive, but that happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So another thing that struck me about this idea of life as an individual is, you know, when we try to think of life as a kind, right? We have this problem that we've mentioned that, okay, it looks like there just aren't necessary insufficient conditions, and so, you know, you get these kind of vague cases like, do viruses count as life, do prions count as life? But I mean, I don't know if this is a problem for your position, or if, I mean, maybe this is just, like I say, just a question. I mean, aren't you going to get the same issue with what counts as part of the individual? I mean, actually, you kind of suggested this a little bit when you were talking about what counts, when you were talking about the fact that, well, there's a lot of cells in your body that are prokaryotic, right? When you try to specify what counts as part of the individual Carlos, right? Does the gut microbiota count as part, or is it like a separate thing that has important causal connections or something? So I guess with life as an individual, like, okay, so do viruses count as part of that individual or not? Does it matter?
Great question. No, it really, I think it matters. Yeah. And I think that you'll have to make choices at various points, right? Because there are things, but I don't think that these are different in kind than the choices we make normally about whether your gut microbiota count as you. And so there are people, sometimes you think about it as the left wing and the right wing of biology, right? Like the left wing of biology would allow the microbial community and us to count as its own emergent individual. And sometimes the term that's used there is holobiont. The right wing is everything that we believed in 1930 of biology, and so each of those are separate individuals, and they're all interacting, and they influence each other. I think there's a good, interesting, fruitful debate to be had there, but I tend to be very pragmatic about a lot of these decisions, and so I tend to think. I'm often accused of being a pragmatist. I tend to think the answer to this is going to depend on the question you ask and what you're looking for. So, do viruses get to count as being part of that's weird. Sorry. Do viruses get to count as part of the individual of life with a capital L? They have some history that they share with us. We actually don't know that history. We don't know where viruses come from. There's 3 separate hypotheses to how they originate, and we don't even know if they all are related to each other. So we don't know that history. It's one of the biggest black boxes in biology. But if it matters for our particular question about life here on Earth, for answering the question, do they get to count as a member of this individual? I think yes, most of the time. No on Tuesdays and Thursdays, depending on the questions you're asking. I mean, do the microbes in our gut get to count as part of us? Yes to some people, no to other people. The same question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So, well, hopefully people have got a sense of this idea of life as an individual. But well, like we said at the beginning, astrobiology, concern for life throughout the universe. So I mean, if life is an individual, right? Then what does that mean for the search for life elsewhere? I mean, obviously, you're not going to get life with a capital L elsewhere, right? Because it's just here. So does this does this rule out the possibility of like universal generalizations about biology, say?
I hope not, because yeah, that's one of the. I mean, my dissertation was titled "Universal Biology," and I hope not. I think what this does is this deflates some of the issues that people had. Right, so in the 1970s, we launched a search for life on Mars, and we sent a couple of life detection experiments there. Most of which returned either neutral or negative results, including there was no organics to be found. One returned a positive result, and people were confused as to how to interpret it. Was it life? Was it not? Well, I mean, there's no there. It was a positive result. It was some interesting chemistry. So what we should be looking for is all sorts of interesting chemistry. And some of that interesting chemistry is going to have evolutionary features, which are going to be really cool and worth exploring. We're going to find some mechanisms for maintaining cohesion and for maintaining a balance with your environment. And so those are going to be worth exploring as well. And so my approach to searching for life elsewhere is, well, let's look for the kinds of things that we could detect. So we could detect some metabolic activity, some processing of environmental variables. And the more complex, the better. The more out of thermodynamic equilibrium that you can find, the better. And there are probably some universal generalizations that you could make about how metabolism works in this universe. There's also some universal generalizations about how evolution works, and people that have been doing evolutionary biology, including people that study it in natural experiments or elaborate experiments or on computers, they've been in the process of drawing broad conclusions about how evolution works. It turns out it works in lots of different ways, even here on Earth. So that diversity of how evolution works is worth exploring to see if there's universal generalizations there. So in a sense, my approach is we just break down the question about looking for life and finding universal features of life into all of the constituent parts that I think are more conceptually and theoretically well-defined. And when we do that, I think we'll find all of the things that we were looking for that were interesting, and maybe more, because we won't be blinded by trying to find this. Like, we thought we were going to find like rabbits, right? Like we thought it was just going to hit us over the head and be like, oh, obviously it's alive. We're not going to be looking for that. We're just going to be looking for interesting chemistry.
I just want to follow up on one of those examples, because you gave the example of the Mars experiments from, what was it, the 70s, I think.
75 and 6. Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember the exact details of these. I think the positive result was something like there was a gas that was produced or something that was thought to be indicative of life. I don't know. Do you know the detail of this one?
Sure. Yeah, I can fill that in. It was called the labeled release experiment by Gil Levin, who still argues to this day that he detected life on Mars, right? What they did was it's been a while since I've thought about this, but they produced some radioactive organics, right? So it's just like things that would look like food to microbes. basically, but that would be detectable. So they fed it to the Martian regolith, which is what we call soil on Mars. They fed it, and then they detected to see if there was any chemical reactions happening where they could detect their nutrients in different forms, right? So you labeled some things, you feed it to the Martian regolith to see if it does anything with them, and they did. They detected some processes happening. And then they superheated the soil before they did the experiment again. And when you do that, they didn't detect the interesting chemistry happening. So one interpretation is that there were creatures that you killed when you superheated it, but that were alive otherwise. Another interpretation is that there was some chemical features of the regolith that disappeared or were not active after you superheat it. I think that those two are roughly equivalent. I don't think that there's going to be a there. But it was so confusing and confounding to the scientists who were expecting all of their experiments to either be positive or negative, that they just gave up, and we didn't send other life detection missions for another 40 years after that. I think we're about to do that soon.
Right.
So
yeah. It seems to me like this case is just one where I don't know. My reaction is, okay, so we've got this somewhat unusual result, but we don't really know enough to say anything more about it, right? That's kind of how I react to it. I don't. I'm not sure how the view of life that you've proposed here really connects to that, because it seems like one thing that might happen is we might do more studies on this, and then we'll just react to it by saying, it turns out that this is just this, like, even intuitively, this is just a purely abiotic process, and it's okay, it's just one of these things that is producing an unusual result. Conceivably, we might do some more studies and then look through a microscope and be like, oh wow, there are cells there. Sure. and then the reaction would be, okay, that's clearly life. It seemed like what you were suggesting is that this is a case where we have something that, whether or not you want to count it as life depends on what similarities you care about. And I'm just, like, my reaction to this case is we just don't know enough.
That's fine. I don't think we know enough. Right. Yeah. So, I think here's where I think the rubber meets the road. Had we not been building up the Viking lander experiments as looking for life, then when we detected that kind of interesting chemistry, it would have been good motivation to send more experiments there later, right? Oh, we found some really cool metabolic-y looking processes. Cool. So maybe we will, next time we try to bring a sample back, and so we can do experiments here on Earth. Or maybe next time we do different kinds of experiments that would corroborate this. But because we didn't do that, because we thought that it was just going to hit us over the head, it actually demotivated people looking for life on Mars and elsewhere. And so because there was this philosophical naivete, we just didn't do the research that I think would have been really cool and really interesting to do for decades. But yeah, you're right. It's interesting. It requires more study. We don't know enough.
Right. Okay. How are you for the time at the moment?
I could chat a little longer, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay then. So, because I did also want to go into this question of, I mean, what we can be at least justified in claiming about, I don't know if I should say life, but you know,
Sure. Sure.
you know, I think you like use the term evolved complexity in one of the
Yes.
so yeah, evolved complexity elsewhere in the universe. So okay, given that we only have one example of life, and I mean, on your view, we're only going to have just one example of life with a capital L. I mean, so what, like, how do we, or can we, make general claims about the nature of evolved complexity throughout the universe, or do we just have to wait for
No, we can
more evidence?
we can do all sorts of no we can make claims about things that are evolved and things that are complex. And there's research programs in both, right? So lots of philosophy of biology, lots of computational biology, modeling in biology studies evolution. There's this research program on complexity for free, on how complexity is generated, whether complexity is progressive over universal history, like, and I think those are all things that we can study. I mean, we can directly observe some complexity, right? So there are people that have studied the history of the universe and argue that over time it's gotten more and more complex, and that there's this kind of linear-ish progression. I think there's big debates over that, so I don't want to actually subscribe to that view. But there's people that study how you get complexity from just Boolean, just generating lots of examples, lots of like data, and how things can start clumping together and connecting to each other and creating weird networks. So the internet's super duper complex, and it's really just it seems like it's more than the sum of its parts, right? It's more than just the computers that make it up. And I think if we were to detect something that scientists might be willing to call life elsewhere, then we can study other ways that evolved complexity comes about naturally, right, without separating the two. And that would be really interesting. I mean, I think we can do some of that in labs, right? We can do some of that with synthetic chemistry and synthetic biology. But there's this rule in biology, Orgel's second law, that evolution is cleverer than you are, which is, maybe we should go out looking for things that we could not have produced in labs, we could not have modeled. And when we discover those, there might be even more conclusions to draw, and that would be really cool.
Yeah. I mean, so one question about some of those examples, I mean, maybe not the case for the lab ones actually, but it looks like a lot of the generalizations we can draw about life as a whole are generalizations that aren't specifically biological. I mean, so something like, say, the surface area to volume ratio that limits the size of cells. You might look at that and say, well, okay, yeah, maybe that's going to be true in general, right? But that just follows from constraints to do with physics or something. How are we? Can we be justified in drawing biological conclusions about
Right. Good.
life overall. I don't know if that made sense. I mean, obviously there's a difficulty there with specifying exactly what the lines are between different disciplines, but hopefully there's a coherent question.
No, I think it is. I mean, I feel like you've there's this paper by John Beatty, who's a great philosopher and historian of science in Canada, UBC, I want to say, where he developed something called the evolutionary contingency thesis. And the evolutionary contingency thesis is this: evolution brings things into existence and it can bring things out of existence. Everything that is distinctively biological doesn't get to count as universal because it can be brought out of existence. But there are universal features, surface to volume ratio, like whatever, trophic levels, energy flow, that kind of stuff. Those might apply to biology, but they don't get to count as distinctively biological. I've talked to John about this, and I've thought about this quite a bit, and I'm not actually motivated in that same way. I don't know if distinctively biological is any really interesting category worth exploring. I think if something is interesting and it applies to biology, then that's fine, and that's what we're looking for. Because the demarcation of different disciplines, I mean, I find it really hard to motivate. I think that if you ask me what gets to count as a biologist, here's a terrible answer. Did they graduate with a biology degree? Did they do they work in buildings that have the word biology in them? Does their business card have biology? Do they publish in journals with the word biology in them? That's a terrible answer, but I think it's almost as good as any other answer you can give. And the same for any other discipline. So yes, there's principles of physics and principles of math and whatever that apply to biology. And I think those are interesting and worth exploring. Whether it counts as distinctively biological or not, I find that hard to really grapple with, because the more I try to dig at that question, the less there is.
Yeah.
Not that it's a bad question. I mean, it's there's really smart people that have pushed that. So, thanks for pushing it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, I think that's about an hour. I did think we should probably just address, just because it's a recent significant discovery. I mean, what is your take on the phosphine gas on Venus? It seems like it might be worth ending on that. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, no. I think it's roughly the same as my Viking Lander take. I posted a set of thoughts on Twitter when it happened. By the way, at Proflos, Proflos.
I'll put a link up when I put up the video.
Sure.
So.
I think that we detected something that is really hard to produce abiotically, we think. And there's been a lot of pushback since that paper came out. It's not exactly my area, so I don't, the chemistry is a little bit beyond me. But I think that it's the kind of thing that's worth exploring. I've often thought that Venus was interesting. There's a guy named David Grinspoon who's been pushing the view that there might be microbes on the clouds of Venus, and he's been pushing it for decades. I don't know how plausible that is to me, but I definitely think that it was a really cool discovery, and we don't need to go farther and say that it counts as similar enough to life in a certain way, or that there's something underlying it that we might want to call life with a lowercase l. It's just interesting and fun. And I'm glad we're doing these studies. We should do more. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's everything then. So
Excellent.
thanks. Yeah. Thanks
Thank you
very
for
much
having
that.
me.
Yeah. Like I said, that was the first interview I did. So I mean, I hope that was all right.
I had fun. I hope your audience enjoyed it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for
I will switch off the recorder here. Okay. Goodbye, everybody.